Questions without notice. The member for Rankin.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister representing the Special Minister of State. On 24 February 2014, the Department of Finance advised the Special Minister of State to reject former Senator Day's request to establish his taxpayer-funded electorate office in a property he owned, saying, and I quote, "Finance has concerns about how such a transaction might be perceived." Why did the minister ignore this advice?
The Minister representing the Special Minister of State, the Treasurer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his question. And these matters have been addressed in a full statement by the Minister for the Deputy Leader of Government in the Senate, the Minister for Finance, the Honourable Matthias Cormann, and I'm happy to table that statement for the benefit of the House.
The member for Robertson has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister update the House on the government's efforts to counter the ongoing threat of people smuggling? Are there any impediments to keeping Australia's borders secure?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for her question. Mr Speaker, a little over 3 years ago, Australia's borders were porous. The Labor government had utterly failed in its fundamental duty to Australians to keep their nation secure. Despite the pleas from the coalition, the Rudd government and its successor, the Gillard government, abandoned John Howard's border protection policies, and we saw 50,000 unauthorised arrivals on more than 800 boats. We saw over 8,000 children put into immigration detention by Labor governments. We saw, most tragically of all, 1,200 and more deaths at sea. That's what we know about. And of course, when Kevin Rudd came back as Prime Minister for his 100 days, he reopened the offshore facilities in Nauru and Manus, and he said in July 2013, he said, "Nobody who seeks to come to Australia by boat shall ever be able to settle in Australia." He finally realised his policy had been a failure. So for 3 years, the government has been getting on with the job and cleaning up Labor's mess. Under our Operation Sovereign Borders, there has not been a successful boat arrival in more than 800 days. There have been no deaths at sea. 17 detention centres have been closed, and we've restored security at our borders, restored the integrity in our immigration system, which is the very foundation, Mr Speaker, of the most successful multicultural society in the world, and enables us to operate one of the most generous humanitarian programs in the world, increasing over the next few years to 18,750 refugees every year, and that is in addition to the 12,000 in the special program from Syria and Iraq. Now, the threat is by no means over. Complacency is a great enemy, and that seems to have beset the Labor Party. In the election, the Leader of the Opposition said he was on a unity ticket with us. Well, is he? Is he? We have presented legislation which will do no more than put into law that which both sides of politics have said has been our unity ticket. And we call on the Leader of the Opposition to stand up to the left in his party, support the bill, stand up for our border security, stand up against the people smugglers.
Members on my left, the members for Sydney and McMahon will cease interjecting. The Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister representing the Special Minister of State and goes to items that are not covered in the document he just tabled. On May 2014, the Special Minister of State accepted Bob Day's advice that he had sold his interest in the taxpayer-funded electorate office. But if the Minister, his office or his department had checked publicly available land titles records, they would have discovered that Senator Day still owned the property. Has the government conducted any investigation as to why basic due diligence was not performed?
Hear, hear.
The Minister representing the Special Minister of State.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for his question. I refer the member to the motion moved by Senator Ryan in the other place, which makes note of the fact that in November of 2014 the Department of Finance undertook a title search which confirmed the property was formally transferred to Fullerton Investments in September of 2014.
The member for Page.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and the Minister for Agriculture and Water Resources. Will the Deputy Prime Minister update the House on the Coalition Government's commitment to strong border security policies, including our biosecurity policies? How are pistol and boo, and what are the consequences of adopting alternate approaches?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable member for his question, and obviously in an area where he has cattle himself or in a horticultural area, he's very aware of the requirements of biosecurity. And it was very important that on us becoming the government, on this side becoming the government, we had to refurbish the department with the money required to run biosecurity, because the Labor Party, the Greens and the Independents had decimated the budget. They had more than halved the agricultural department's budget, and we had to find close to $200 million to put into the biosecurity section to give ourselves those stronger borders which are so vitally important. And it's vitally important because, as we know, if a disease such as foot and mouth was to come in, not only would it close the cattle industry down, the sheep industry down, the wool industry down, the goat industry down, the pig industry down, but also put out of work the meat workers, the transport union workers. It would be absolutely devastating for shearers. It would be cataclysmic in regional areas, and it would reverberate amongst the city as well. But it's not just foot and mouth. It's also screw fly, it's exotic wheat stem disease. It's also rabies, and we're trying to make sure that we keep these diseases out of our nation. And the way we keep them out of our nation, of course, is that we have a proper vetting process at the border. But unfortunately, at times, some people decide to go around that vetting process and to make their own arrangements. And in the past, this nation has had the experience of people literally arriving at the beaches south of where the member for Page resides, arriving at Scott's Head, literally walking off the boat and start walking down the street. We had them arriving at Geraldton. They arrived at Geraldton, where they basically just walked back onto the beach. They arrived at Bamaga dressed in suits and asked for if they could catch a taxi to Sydney. This was a bizarre position which Australia was placed in, and we had to do something about it. And that is why we are asking for stronger border security. And when we have stronger borders, then we have the capacity to be compassionate, like we will see tonight on Australian Story, where we welcome refugees from Rwanda and into my electorate in New England. But we have a test. We have a test for the Labor Party. Is the Labor Party going to stand by their own commitment that they gave to the Australian people at the last election, that they were working basically on a unity ticket with us, a unity ticket in such a way that we will have strong borders? Because people who come in illegally, not only do they come in illegally, but the diseases that might be with them in an unvetted way, they also come in with them. Now we have to do something about that. And if we want that ambiguity removed, if we want to be decisive, if we want to see strong leadership, if we want to see the proper sense that the person Mr Shorten, the member for Maribyrnong, was before the election, is still the same person he is after the election, then he has that chance. He has that chance. And rather than looking at the clock, you should look at your ticker.
Members on my left, member for Hunter. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Is the Prime Minister satisfied that the government's handling of Bob Day's electorate office in 2014 was appropriate?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, all of the facts and circumstances relating to Mr Day, now former Senator Day's electorate office, have been set out in comprehensive detail in both the speech from Senator Cormann and, I would add, also the speech from Senator Ryan, the Special Minister of State. The circumstances of 2014 are not matters that I have any personal knowledge of. Well,
Members on my left.
These are matters. They were matters. They were matters handled by the then Special Minister of State, Senator Ronaldson. The important thing to recognise is that when this issue, when the issues relating to Senator Day's office came to the knowledge of Senator Ryan, the facts were thoroughly investigated, advice was dutifully and diligently sought, and the actions that followed, including providing those conclusions to the President of the Senate, were carried out. Mr. Speaker, I'm satisfied that my government has conducted itself with respect to this matter with great diligence and great integrity and great thoroughness.
The member for Melbourne.
Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Environment and Energy. A number of eminent Australians, including the head of Australia's biggest power company AGL, a former Governor-General and a former head of Telstra, have today urged the government to facilitate the phased and controlled closure of coal-fired electricity. Now that Hazelwood, Australia's dirtiest power station, is to be closed, will the government agree to put into law a plan for the orderly retirement of coal-fired power stations so that workers, communities and clean energy investors can plan for the future? Or will you continue to leave our energy system to the chaos of the market so that decisions about Australia's future energy security and the welfare of places like the Latrobe Valley are left to the boardrooms of Paris, Tokyo and Hong Kong?
The Minister for the Environment and Energy has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for Melbourne for his question, because it's been 690 days since I've ever had a question from the Labor Party, Mr. Speaker. Now the member for Melbourne mentions a report. I did receive that report today, and I thank Jeff Cousins and Professor Jacobs and that group of eminent Australians. But I tell you, the hypocrisy of the Greens is amazing, because you know what they did when 750 people lost their jobs at Hazelwood with the announcement last week? They put out a Facebook post, Mr. Speaker, and what did they say? This is great news, Mr. Speaker. This is great news.
The Minister knows
Mr.
the rules
Speaker,
on the use of props.
Shame on the Greens. Shame on the Greens for celebrating the misery of the hard-working 750 Victorians who have now lost their jobs at Hazelwood. Now, Mr. Speaker, we recognise that a lower emissions future is a good thing. We also recognise that energy security is our #1 priority. And rather than be irresponsible like those opposite who have joined with the Greens most recently in the Senate to support a motion encouraging the closure of coal-fired power plants, we will do everything to ensure the stability of our system. You see, for the Greens, it's all care and no responsibility. They don't care if we see a repeat of the blackout in South Australia. They don't care if there's gridlock on their roads. You don't care if Ariam loses its power and Olympic Dam loses its power and the Port Pirie smelter loses its power and people are put out of work. You don't care because you only believe in ideology, Mr. Speaker. The Greens only believe in ideology. And what is appalling is now we have seen a return of the Greens-Labor alliance. Those opposite are prepared to trade the blue-collar jobs in the regions, for Green votes in the city, Mr. Speaker. They're prepared to trade blue-collar jobs in the regions for Green votes in the city. And where do we see that? We saw that in a motion, Mr. Speaker. The motion was in the Senate on the 13th of October, which had said the Greens and the Labor Party
The Minister will resume his
support.
seat. The member for Melbourne Ports on a point of order.
Mr. Speaker, there's 30 seconds to
No,
go.
on a
On
point of
relevance, he
order.
might like to explain
Member
his
for
plan
Melbourne
for
can
jobs
resume
in the
his
valley
seat.
if he cares.
The Minister has the call.
Greens and the Labor Party, and I have a quote here from their Senate motion, want to support policy mechanisms to encourage the retirement of coal-fired power stations. Mr. Speaker, only the Coalition cares about energy security. Only the Coalition cares about jobs in regional Australia, and only the Coalition will keep electricity prices affordable to all Australians.
The member for SWAN.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Immigration and Border Protection. Will the minister update the House on steps the government is taking to further strengthen Australia's border protection policies? And is the minister aware of a less successful approach?
The Minister for Immigration and Border Protection.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for his question. And he sits on the Backbench Committee, chairs the committee, a very important committee, which is working with me, with the Assistant Minister, and making sure that we can do whatever is possible to keep our borders secure, because if we don't keep our borders secure, we can't keep our country safe. Now, Mr Speaker, in 2007 there was an election campaign, and in the run-up to that election, Mr Rudd, the then opposition leader, wanted to pretend to Australians that Labor was united in essentially a unity ticket with the then Howard government in the policies that they would preside over if they won the 2007 election to make sure that the boats remained stopped. Now, the rest, of course, is well known and well documented. As the Prime Minister pointed out before, when the Howard government left office in 2007, there were 4 people in detention, including no children. Sadly, 1,200 people lost their lives at sea, at least 1,200 people, and people opposite, including the former shadow minister in this space, made a very impassioned speech at last year's Labor conference apologising on behalf of the Labor Party for that policy failing. Now, thousands of children went into detention at the same time, and Labor opened up 17 detention centres. Since we've been in government, Mr Speaker, we have been able to preside over success. We have re-implemented the policies that worked for the Howard government. We are in the process of cleaning up Labor's mess. As the Prime Minister points out, we are at the same time as stopping the boats and stopping the deaths at sea, closing the detention centres and getting the children out of detention, able to bring in a record number of people through the refugee and humanitarian program. But Labor is making the same mistake now under this Leader of the Opposition that they made during Kevin Rudd's time as Leader of the Labor Party. That is that they want to believe that this problem has gone away. The reality, Mr Speaker, and all Australians recognise this because they see the deaths at sea in the Mediterranean. They see what is happening in Europe and they see what is happening in Africa. They know that there are 14,000 people waiting in Indonesia to get onto boats tomorrow, and that is why this government is absolutely determined to do everything that we can to stop those people getting on boats, and we are going to introduce legislation. We are going to demand the support from the Labor Party because we want to send a clear and consistent message to people smugglers, which wasn't possible when Kevin Rudd lost control of our borders and those people drowned. But it is possible now, Mr Speaker, because this government has worked hard. We have stopped boats. We do want to get people off Manus and Nauru. We want to do it in a way, though, that doesn't recreate new boat arrivals and new people filling those vacancies. But the problem for Labor is at the moment that there are 26 at least, those that heckle and scream out in this debate right now, who are opposed to Mr Shorten and are part of the reason that he cannot lead a united Labor Party.
The Minister's time has expired. The member for Cowan is also warned. The Leader of the Opposition has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. In light of the Prime Minister's refusal to endorse the coalition government's handling of Bob Day's electorate office in 2014, has the Prime Minister made any inquiries as to whether Senator Ronaldson advised the Finance Minister or the then Prime Minister that Senator Ronaldson was rejecting the department's advice in order to assist Bob Day?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank the Leader of the Opposition for his interest in the qualifications of senators. And I just remind him that in the Minister for Finance's speech in the Senate earlier today, he sets out in some detail the arrangements that Senator Ronaldson, as then the Special Minister of State, entered into with Senator Day, including on the express basis that Senator Day no longer had an interest in the property, that there'd be no net cost to the Commonwealth, and so forth. And all of that is set out in the Finance Minister's speech, and further detail is set out in the Special Minister of State speech in the Senate today. But, Mr Speaker, dealing with qualifications of senators, a matter more immediate and relevant is the qualifications of Senator Kimberley Kitching, not personally nominated by the Leader of the Opposition.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Treasurer will Leader of the House will cease interjecting. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order. Members on my right, member for Mitchell, the Deputy Prime Minister. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Yeah, Mr Speaker, it's on direct relevance. The question did not have a preamble. The question did not have—
The Leader of the House will cease interjecting.
There's a series of rulings you've made where if questions use particular language, then the gates are wide open. This question was very specific, very tight, and on that basis where the Prime Minister has now gone is clearly beyond the direct relevance rule.
I thank the Manager of Opposition Business. I have been listening very closely to the Prime Minister and I respect what the Manager of Opposition Business said. I do have to say I was on the verge of ruling the question out of order. I really was, because it's asking the Prime Minister about a previous government. And, but in the interests of allowing free-flowing debate, I allowed the question. I could have taken a stricter ruling at the time. I deliberately decided not to. The Prime Minister is addressing the substance of the question. I'll keep listening to the Prime Minister, but certainly the subject matter of the Leader of the Opposition's question, at this point I'm ruling that the Prime Minister is still in order.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. So the Leader of the Opposition asked me what inquiries I've made. The real question today, given Senator Kitching has been sworn in the other place, is what inquiries has the Leader of the Opposition made? Has he inquired whether in fact the Director of Public Prosecutions is going to act on the reference to it by the Hayden Royal Commission that referred papers and an interim report to the DPP to consider whether Kimberley Kitching should be charged with and prosecuted for aiding and abetting the contraventions of each of Diana Asmar, David Eden, Darren Rowe, Nick Katzis, Sasso Trzaskowski Uzanov and Lee Atkinson? Has he made an inquiry as to whether the finding that she, by Fair Work Commission Vice President Watson, that she had been untruthful and unreliable in her evidence, that she had completed other people's tests? Has he inquired about those matters? Because, Mr Speaker, that's in the here and now. Senator Kitching's been sworn in today. What assurance can the Leader of the Opposition give us that those allegations made, those concerns raised, that evidence given concerning now Senator Kitching, his hand-picked senator, what assurance can he give us that he has inquired and been satisfied that all of those findings are utterly without basis?
The Deputy Prime Minister will cease interjecting. The member for PETRIE.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Foreign Affairs. Will the Minister please update the House on Australia's support to the international coalition to defeat ISIL in Mosul and Raqqa?
The Minister for Foreign Affairs.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for PETRIE for his question, and I acknowledge his concern about the threat posed by terrorist organisations like ISIL, which have attracted support from radicalised extremists from many countries, including Australia. Mr Speaker, United States-backed fighters in Syria have launched an Operation Euphrates Rage to seize ISIL's de facto capital of Raqqa in Syria. This morning, US Defence Secretary Ash Carter welcomed the commencement of this operation by the Syrian Defence Forces, an alliance of Kurdish and Arab armed groups, declaring that the operation, quote, marks the next step, end quote, in the international coalition campaign to defeat ISIL. Mr Speaker, the Australian government also welcomes the commencement of this campaign, which comes as the military operation to liberate Mosul in Iraq enters its fourth week. By taking Mosul and Raqqa away from ISIS control, the false narrative of ISIL's self-proclaimed Islamic Caliphate will be destroyed. However, like the operation to liberate Mosul, we know that seizing Raqqa will be difficult, dangerous and will take time. Australia continues to play a critical role in both Iraq and Syria as a significant contributor to the international counter-ISIL campaign. In Iraq, Australian Defence Force personnel are providing vital support to the Iraqi security forces throughout the Mosul offensive. Australian aircraft continue to conduct airstrikes and provide enabling air support around Mosul. Australian Special Forces are advising and assisting the Iraqi Counter-Terrorism Service, which is spearheading the Mosul offensive. And Australian forces are continuing their training of Iraqi security units as part of our Building Partner Capacity mission. In Syria, Australian planes and personnel are conducting air operations against ISIL targets in eastern Syria, including in the vicinity of Raqqa. Australia's military support in Iraq and Syria is in addition to the critical humanitarian assistance we're providing in response to the conflicts. Australia has committed humanitarian and stabilisation assistance in both the Iraq and Syria crises, which now stands at over $500 million. This has contributed to providing support to millions of people fleeing the conflicts and the horrors and the depravity of ISIL. Mr Speaker, Australia remains committed to the global effort to defeat ISIL and other terrorist organisations, and these are organisations that directly threaten our communities by radicalising and training potential terrorists from our country. We will continue our fight to keep our people safe.
The Manager of Opposition Business.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Special Minister of State has today told the Senate that he informed the Prime Minister's office on the 18th of August this year that there was a potential issue under section 44 of the Constitution in relation to former Senator Day. On what date was the Prime Minister personally aware of this information?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. As the Special Minister of State observed in his document shortly thereafter, and my recollection is that it was some days thereafter, several days thereafter, he advised me that he had spoken to my Chief of Staff in those terms, and he says here, well, I'll read what he said. He said, I informed the Office of the Prime Minister by telephone call to his Chief of Staff, this was on the 18th of August, that there was an issue with respect to the electorate office of Senator Day. There were potential issues about which I'd contacted the Attorney-General. I was seeking advice, and if this matter was raised, it was to be referred to me. Senator Ryan goes on to say, I subsequently mentioned to the Prime Minister that I had a conversation with his Chief of Staff, outlined the terms of that conversation, and that matters relating to this were to be referred to me, and that's consistent with my recollection too.
The member for MACKELLAR.
Update the House on how ending lawlessness on our building sites will reduce costs and boost productivity in building and construction industry. Is the Treasurer aware of any vested interests that continue to undermine the efficiency of this important sector of our national economy?
The Treasurer has the call.
Speaker, I thank the member for MACKELLAR for his question, and those opposite seem excited about the topic, Mr Speaker, as certainly we are, because it is important that we restore the Australian Building and Construction Commission to improve productivity, improve growth, improve job prospects for those working in the construction industry, because we know that illegal and militant behaviour of unions on construction and building sites is costing Australians jobs, it is costing them better wages, it is costing this country increased investment that supports the growth of our economy more broadly. We know that the Master Builders Australia estimates that the increase in construction costs on whether it's schools or hospitals or other important taxpayer-funded projects, roads and so on, increases the cost by some 30% in additional costs. But you would think that the CFMEU and others would at least put aside one particular type of site as being free of the sort of illegal and coercive behaviour which has been found by the Fair Work Commission. You would think that a project run by Common Ground in Brisbane, a 146 apartment project funded by taxpayers to deal with long-term homelessness, would be exempt from the sort of thuggery that we have seen from the CFMEU, which the Leader of the Opposition describes as the side of the angels, Mr Speaker. We know from Fair Work Commission that on this project, some $545,000 in fines was put on the CFMEU for disrupting work on that site for 7 days. Now, on a site of that size, you can estimate that the cost of the actual project was probably somewhere closest to $700,000. What we know is that the officials, it says in the statement by Fair Work, showed no contrition, they showed no remorse, but they agreed they engaged in coercion
Member for Griffith is warned.
that they disrupted work at the site for 7 days in a bid to coerce the head contractor, Grocon, to sign an enterprise agreement. Now, Mr Miles, who's one of the union officials there on the site, used words to this effect. He said to the subbies on the site, "You've got a long time left in this industry and we can influence your future jobs." The subcontractor asks, "What are the consequences to my business if I bring my boys on site?" Mr Cradden replied, another official, "You want to know what the consequences are? You would be committing industrial suicide." Now, that's what we heard, Mr Speaker, from CFMEU officials on a site, on a project that was trying to build housing, shelter for homeless people, Mr Speaker. Yet this Leader of the Opposition describes that behaviour as the side of the angels, Mr Speaker. This is an opposition in the pocket of the CFMEU with some $6 million in donations, which they continue to loll around.
Has expired. The member for Lindsay will cease interjecting. The Leader of the Opposition has the call.
My question is to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister has just confirmed that he was aware in August that Senator Day's election possibly contravened the Constitution. How can it be that since then, for every single day that the 45th Parliament has sat, the Prime Minister has been aware that the composition of the Senate was potentially illegitimate? And why did the Prime Minister decide to keep this information secret from the Australian people?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, we have yet another example of the sanctimonious humbug we get time and time again from the Leader of the Opposition. What you have seen today, as presented by the Special Minister of State and the Finance Minister in the Senate, is an example of a government diligently investigating facts which came to its attention, seeking advice, and then, when that advice was received, handing it on to the President of the Senate. Now, the honourable member opposite may reflect on this, that on the Saturday, October 29th, he stood before the Labor State Conference in Queensland and he denounced the government and he denounced me for relying on the vote of Senator Day. He denounced us for that. And yet, the day before, the Special Minister of State had handed to the President of the Senate a set of papers including legal advice from senior counsel which stated that there were good grounds for concluding that Senator Day's position in the Senate was ineligible. In other words, that he was ineligible to stand at the election. So that shows what humbug we get from the Leader of the Opposition. The fact is that as Senator Ryan and Senator Cormann have set out, as the facts emerged concerning Senator Day's office, they then investigated it, taking great care to do so diligently, seeking legal advice from the Australian Government Solicitor, seeking legal advice from senior counsel, and then, when that advice was received, provided it to the President of the Senate. The government has acted with the utmost integrity and with diligence, and that is set out. The honourable member opposite, filled with sanctimony, filled with humbug, filled with all of his claims of overreach. What we have seen here is a government dealing with this matter diligently and with integrity. And yet what he has done is personally handpicked to the Senate, Kimberley Kitchen, who was referred to the Commonwealth Director of Public Prosecutions for consideration to be charged with serious offences, who was found to have been untruthful in her evidence to the Fair Work Commission. What steps has he taken to find out, to satisfy himself that Commissioner Hayden's conclusions were wrong, that Deputy President Watson's conclusions were wrong? Because if he has not done that, if he cannot stand up here and say Kimberley Kitching is blameless and without any offence, then you have put her into the Senate on the basis that she has been scammed by that.
Just before I call the member for Bonner, I'd just like to draw members' attention to the fact that the former member for Paterson, the Honourable Bob Baldwin, is with us in the gallery this afternoon. The member for Bonner.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence Industry representing the Minister for Employment. Will the Minister outline to the House the government's commitment to ensure that employer and employee organisations always act in the best interests of their members? What impediments stand in the way of achieving this outcome?
The Minister for Defence Industry, the Leader of the House.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Bonner for his question, and he's right that it is critical to reform unions and other registered organisations in Australia, and the Coalition, of course, supports honest unions and we support honest union leaders. And what we've seen in the Health Services Union and what we've seen in the CFMEU and the MUA and other unions confirms the need for a Registered Organisations Commission. And so, Mr Speaker, the question is, why is the Leader of the Opposition standing in the way of cleaning up the unions? You would expect that the Leader of the Opposition would want to actually clean up the unions because of the symbiotic relationship between the ALP and the union movement. But in fact the opposite is true, Mr Speaker. He is the one standing in the way. He is the hurdle to the passage of the Registered Organisations Commission. There can only be one conclusion as to why that is the case, and it's obviously because the Leader of the Opposition is the cat's paw of the union movement. And the latest example of this, Mr Speaker, is the elevation of Kimberley Kitching to the Senate, to the Australian Senate. Now, this person was handpicked by the Leader of the Opposition in a captain's call over the objections of the retiring Senator Conroy, over the objections of the member for Corio, over the objections of all the usual people who advised the Leader of the Opposition about the management of the Victorian Party. So one has to ask the question and answer it, why would that be the case? This person, Kimberley Kitching, was referred by the Hayden Royal Commission for prosecution to the Commonwealth DPP for impersonating union officials and filling out their tests, their safety tests, to go on work sites. She in fact bragged about it and used to go into her superiors and say, yep, 100% again, got 100% for the test again. So she impersonated 6 union officials, including the head of the union, Diana Asma, so they could pass their safety tests and go on work sites. Do you condone that in the Labor Party? Is that what the Labor Party thinks is reasonable behaviour? What if a worker on one of those work sites was hurt because one of those union leaders went onto the work site and had not properly passed a safety test? And yet that is the person who Labor put into the Senate. So all their crocodile tears about workers' rights and the safety of workers and how the CFMEU stands up for those workers who have been injured or even lost their lives in workplaces stands for nothing, because instead they put into the Senate someone who impersonated union officials, filled out their safety tests for them and potentially put workers in danger. The Labor Party stands condemned, and there'll be a lot more of this, I can tell you.
I'm going to caution the member for Griffith right now. Leader of the Opposition has the call.
Thank you. My question is to the Prime Minister. Since the Prime Minister refused to answer my last question, I will ask again. How can it be that for every single day that the 45th Parliament has sat, The Prime Minister has been aware that the composition of the Senate was potentially illegitimate, and why did the Prime Minister decide to keep this information secret from the Australian people?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you.
The member for Lindsay is now warned.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The reality is simply this. As you know, as we all know, Senator Ryan became aware that there was an issue concerning the nature or the extent, the character of Senator Day's interest in his office. He investigated that. He did so diligently. He sought advice. The idea that any member of the government, the Special Minister of State or any other, would have gone out and made allegations or made conclusions until the facts had been thoroughly investigated and advice sought is absurd and reckless. The honourable member opposite knows full well that in a matter of this kind, Senator Ryan acted absolutely appropriately. He let my office know and he let me know that he was investigating.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The member for McMahon and the member for Sydney will not interject again. They've been warned. The Leader of the House will cease interjecting. The Leader of the Opposition.
I seek leave to move the following motion. That the House 1 notes that the Prime Minister was willing to trade guns for votes with Senator Layenholme. The Prime Minister is willing to trade race-hate protections to protect himself from his backbench. That the Prime Minister has traded cash for votes with ex-Senator Day. And today, in an extraordinary turn of events, it's been revealed that the Prime Minister knew for more than 2 months that there was a potential issue under section 44 of the Constitution in relation to Senator Day, and chose to bring the Parliament back and keep that information secret from the Australian people, and therefore condemns the Prime Minister for being willing to do absolutely anything to keep his job, and for his weak leadership, which is inflicting chaos on the Parliament and the country.
Is leave granted? Leave is not granted. The Leader of the Opposition
Protection
has the
racket.
call.
I move that so much of the standing and sessional orders be suspended as would prevent the Leader of the Opposition from moving the following motion forthwith. That the House 1 notes that the Prime Minister was willing to trade guns for votes with Senator Layenholme. The Prime Minister is willing to trade race-hate protections to protect himself from his backbench. The Prime Minister has traded cash for votes with Senator Day. And today, in an extraordinary turn of events, it's been revealed that the Prime Minister knew for more than 2 months there was a potential issue under section 44 of the Constitution in relation to Senator Day, and chose to bring the Parliament back and keep that information secret from the Australian people, and therefore condemns the Prime Minister for being willing to do absolutely anything to keep his job, and for his weak leadership, which is inflicting chaos on the Parliament and the country. Is there anything this Prime Minister won't trade to save his job?
Will resume his seat. The Leader of the House has the call.
Mr. Speaker, in a classic case of overreach, I move that the member be no longer heard.
The Leader of the House has moved that Leader of Opposition be no further heard. All those of that opinion say aye. The contrary, no. If the ayes have it, division required. Ring the bells for 4 minutes. And the member for Lingiari is warned for that exchange, just as we're moving to the division. Lock the doors. Order. The question is that the Leader of the Opposition be no further heard. The ayes will pass to the right of the chair, the noes to the left. I appoint the honourable members for Dawson and Gray. Tell us for the ayes, and the honourable members for Morton and Lawler. Tell us for the noes. Order. The result of the division is ayes 73, noes 69. The question is therefore resolved in the affirmative. Is the motion seconded?
They kept it secret because they wanted his vote.
The
they rorted his office because they wanted his vote.
Seat. The Leader of the House has the call.
He should be. I move the member be no longer heard.
Leader of the House has moved the Manager of Opposition business be no further heard. All those of that opinion say aye. The contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. Division required. Ring the bells for 1 minute. I appoint the same tellers as the previous division. And as always with a 1 minute division, be helpful if members were to remain in their seats during this successive division, unless they're leaving the chamber or did not vote in the previous division or are changing their vote, in which case they should report to the tellers. Lock the doors. Order. The question is that the Manager of Opposition business be no further heard. Members must remain in their seats unless they're changing their vote or did not vote in the previous division, in which case they must report to the tellers. The result of the division is ayes 73, noes 69. The question is therefore resolved in the affirmative. The question now is that the motion be agreed to. The Leader of the House.
That the motion be put.
The Leader of the House has moved that the motion be put. All those of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. Division required. Ring the bells for 1 minute. And I appoint the same tellers as per the previous division. And again, be helpful if members were to remain in their seats during this successive division, unless they're leaving the chamber or did not vote in the previous division or they're changing their vote, in which case they must report to the tellers. Lock the doors. Order. The question is that the motion be put. Members must remain in their seats unless they're changing their vote or did not vote in the previous division, in which case they must report to the tellers. The result of the division is ayes 73, noes 69. The question is therefore resolved in the affirmative. The question now is that the motion moved by the Leader of the Opposition be agreed to. All those of that opinion say aye. The contrary, no. I think the noes have it. Division required. Ring the bells for 1 minute, but the tellers will do a full count. Lock the doors. Order. The question is that the motion moved by the Leader of the Opposition be agreed to. The ayes will pass to the right of the chair, the noes to the left. I appoint the honourable members for Moreton and Lawler tellers for the ayes and the honourable members for Dawson and Gray tellers for the noes. The result of the division is ayes 66, noes 73. The question is therefore resolved in the negative. Cause this side. I've made it very clear. I'm letting people return to their seats. The call is to my right. Yep. Actually, the member for Chisholm will resume her seat for a second. Yeah. The Prime Minister does have the option to complete his answer if he wishes. I think we'll move on to the next. Yes. If members could take their seats as quickly as they can, we can resume question time. The member for Chisholm.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Immigration and Border Protection. Will the Minister update the House on steps the government has taken to remove dangerous criminal gang members from Australian society? What are the consequences of not taking action?
The Minister for Immigration and Border Protection.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for her question. Now, we have cancelled a record number of visas, including bikies, many of whom are involved on building sites working for the CFMEU, and they're the hired muscle. Now, everyone, of course, has a story of a CFMEU union thug turning up on a building site running riot, but I heard an amazing story the other day, Mr Speaker. There was a huge unit construction site in the city, and the motorbike screeches to a halt outside the gates. The rioter, wearing his CFMEU emblazoned jacket with the Rebels bikie tattooed across his forehead, hops off and he walks toward the lady on the stop-and-go sign at the opening of the building site, the entry of the building site. She's a bit nervous, naturally enough, but tries to make him out. She left home in a rush that morning and couldn't find her contact lenses. Julia, the bikie, says. She feels instant relief. It's Bill the bikie. Julia's a part pensioner now. She trusted her friend bikie Bill to find her this job after unexpectedly losing her last gig. It's 2 days a week, 150 grand a year, not a bad deal. But the downside is that her CFMEU dues are $149,000 a year, which makes it a bit tight, but it helps to support her stay-at-home hubby. Now, you're doing a great job here, Julia, says Bill sincerely. She feels secure because her friend, bikie Bill, has her back. The bikie Bill barges forward and he sees the target, the foreman. His target is the foreman. It's Kevin the carpenter. Now, or as Kevin humbly says, carpenter by trade, but future global leader by nature. Anyway, Kevin's talking to a group of on-site workers, the cleaners. He's talking in Chinese, which is strange because none of the workers are Chinese in that group. Now, bikie Bill knows the group well because he did the deal for the cleaners' EBA. 5 cents an hour he got for them. But it makes things a bit tight for their families, but the cleaners are content because they know that the balance of their $100 an hour that in the pay deal that was done for them will go to the CFMEU Professional Development Fund, which has millions and growing, and that the US Teamsters training program would be properly funded to educate the new generation of CFMEU leadership in extortion and hand-to-hand combat. Now, Mr Speaker, the moral of this story is that Julia can never trust.
The Minister will resume his seat. The Deputy Prime Minister will cease interjecting. The member for Grayndler on a point of order.
Yes, Mr Speaker, on weirdness.
The member for Grayndler will resume his seat. Member for Grayndler will resume his seat. Member for Grayndler will resume his seat. Members on my left. The Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, Julia couldn't trust Bikey Bill, Kevin couldn't trust Bikey Bill, the workers can't trust Bikey Bill, and let me tell you, the Australian people do not trust this Leader of the Opposition.
The Minister will resume his seat. The Minister will resume his seat. The member for Moreton will resume his seat. Members on my left will cease interjecting, or they'll be leaving the House rapidly. I'll say one thing for the Minister's answer. He managed to be inventive up until that last moment, and that's why I've asked him to resume his seat. The member for Sydney has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister representing the Minister for Education and Training. I refer to reports that the grant to a Trades Training Centre college linked to former Senator Bob Day was equivalent to $92,000 for each of the 20 students enrolled in the program, despite the fact that an equivalent qualification could have been completed at TAFE for just $3,000 per student. Does the Minister agree that this grant was excessive?
The Minister representing the Minister for Education.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And I am aware that, in fact, the South Australian Government recently attended the North East Vocational College's Student Builder project, and they were very supportive of it, the South Australian Labor Government. So let me provide some facts on this program. Firstly, because of course this is dealing with the issue of former Senator Day. The advice that I have is that the liquidation of Bob Day's building and construction company, Home Australia, will not have an impact on North East Vocational College's Student Builder pilot. The second point is that the Student Builder pilot is being delivered currently and in accordance with the agreement. Thirdly, I'm also advised that the Senator has resigned as a member of the College Board, and I'm advised that board members do not receive any payment, and I am also advised that the former Senator does not have a financial interest in the North East Vocational College. And so the advice we have is that it is being delivered on time and in accordance with the grant. But if our friends on the opposition benches want to talk about the way in which these matters should be handled, let me remind them of three names. Craig Thompson, who was given a ringing endorsement from the Leader of the Opposition, or Eddie O'Bean, who provides ski trips to his friends.
The Minister will resume his seat. Members on both sides, the Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
As would be easily predicted, it's on direct relevance, Mr Speaker.
And I'll say to the Minister before he resumes, he's entitled to compare and contrast. I think the member for Sydney's been warned, and I'd like her to be able to hear the answer to the question she's asked while she's in the chamber. So I say to the Minister he's entitled to compare and contrast, and I think he's done that. The Minister has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I accept, acknowledge and appreciate the advice. In that spirit,
it's not advice, it's a ruling.
And in sum, that we have looked at this matter, and the advice that I have is crystal clear that all of the matters which were agreed as part of the project have been delivered and are being delivered, that those elements which were required to trigger the first round of payments were appropriately delivered, and that is the advice, and that stands in contrast to what we saw from the other side, where they stood by as extraordinary wrongdoing was condoned, allowed and facilitated.
The member for Corangamite.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Trade, Tourism and Investment. What contribution does the construction industry make to Australia's tourism industry? Is the Minister aware of any threats to this contribution?
The Minister for Trade and Investment.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Corangamite for her question, because I know the member for Corangamite has a deep passion for Australia's tourism industry. There are some 3,600 people in her electorate that are directly employed in Australia's tourism industry, and of course an array of others that benefit
from the construction industry and the tourism industry succeeding in her electorate. I note that international visitor arrivals into her electorate are growing faster than domestic arrivals, up 45% compared to 42%. And spending by international tourists is up by some 74% in the last 3 years, so that the total tourism spending in Geelong now represents some $541 million. Now, there can be no doubt that the member for Corangamite has led the charge with respect to the growth of the tourism industry, but also the construction industry. A clear-eyed vision about the benefits that can flow from regional Australia for Australia's tourism industry. But I note, though, that she also asked a question in relation to threats to Australia and to our policy as a result of the contribution made by the construction and tourism industry. And I've got to say that it was revealing, Mr Speaker, revealing last week to see some of the commentary, and in particular a video that just demonstrates how beholden the Australian Labor Party is to Australia's trade union movement. We saw just last week senior CFMEU officials, including the National President Joe McDonald and the WA Assistant State Secretary Graham Pallett. And what were they saying, Mr Speaker? They were happy to say on video that they will put in Labor members of parliament who will support the scrapping of the ABCC, and if they don't, if those opposite don't support the scrapping of the ABCC, what did they say on video? They'll replace them. That's what they said, and that's the threat that hangs on the head of every Labor member opposite, the threat of being replaced. And unfortunately, we see examples of that happening. Just up there in the backbenches, the member for Wills, he was, of course, imposed by the AWU. Now, the locals didn't want, with all due respect to the member for Wills, the locals didn't want him representing him. No, they would rather have, in fact, former senator and long-time local Mehmet Tillman. But what did the AWU do? They imposed someone from the other side of Melbourne with no connections whatsoever to the electorate, thrust him in, shoehorn him into the seat. Why? Because I'm sure when they say the time has come for him to walk away from the ABCC, he will, just like every other member opposite who know that their pre-selection is dependent upon doing the bidding of their union masters.
The member for Solomon will leave under 94A. The Prime Minister has the call.
Ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.
I thank the Prime Minister.